about the techniques, if I may.
Absolutely.
Well, you talk about in your thesis, you talk about X-ray fluorescence, and you talk about ICP-MS.
Yes, sir.
Could you just talk a little bit about those two techniques in terms of, whether they're destructive or non-destructive, and what types of information you can gain from either ICP-MS or fluorescence?
Certainly. So, X-ray fluorescence, mass spectroscopy, that's XRF, MS, bombards the artifact with X-rays, and it allows the researcher to see the weights of the different isotopes of elements within it, right? It is destructive at some point to use XRF. But ICP-MS, the induction coupled plasma mass spectroscopy, that was a major development for everyone, but it's of particular interest to archaeometallurgists because it is not nearly as destructive. The research that I conducted suggested that you could destroy less than half a micron thick layer of atoms on the top of it to get more accurate results than earlier XRF analysis technologies. So many archaeometallurgists, anyone doing metallurgic study in archaeology, is trying to use ICP-MS if they can, because it's non-destructive. It allows us to look at one of those Ulfbert swords is a good example. Hadn't been chemically analyzed until recently, because earlier techniques required destruction, and these weapons are of such a strange high quality that the collections that have them were unwilling to part with even small samples for analysis.
So ICP-MS, it uses very small quantities of sample, right? And that's very useful because it's so very sensitive.
Yeah.
And then ICP-MS, what kind of information can we get from that you can't get from X-ray fluorescence, for example?
If I remember right, ICP-MS will give us it'll give us the radiation, the background radiation quantity. So within metal, the crystalline structure of metal, it traps the background radiation readings of the region where it formed in the deep earth. And if I remember right, ICP-MS can determine that radiation level.
Okay, so ICP-MS is it's a mass spectrometric technique.
Yeah.
Which means it's measuring the mass of the ions. So it can give you very nice quantitative information as far as the elemental composition of the metal, which is one thing that you would like to have. But the other really nice thing it can provide for you is the isotopic composition.
Right.
And so that's a lot of what they did with some of these analyses that you looked at. They looked at the isotopic composition of the lead, and that's really important because it does ultimately result that isotopic composition really does ultimately speak to the origin of the ore.
Yeah.
And that's because of the radiative processes which generate those lead isotopes, basically.
Yeah.
That's good. And then you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, you talked a little bit about how this is something that's been used quite a bit around the world, but not so much in North America. Is that because are there really applications for it in North America that you can imagine, archaeological applications?
There aren't a ton of applications in North American archaeology, for sure.
Okay.
There's a few cultural groups that had metal here. Most of them are Central American or South American. Interestingly enough, I didn't find very much research from South America or Central America either that was archaeometallurgical in design. But I think it's interesting, not because we can't do it here, but because researchers, there are lots of American archaeologists who are interested in the classicals, in Greek and Roman and in Egyptian studies, but very few American archaeologists that I could find that were interested in metallurgy.
Okay. And then last question I have is just for my own education.
Sure.
You talked about relative dating. I'm not sure what that means.
Oh, okay. No problem. So, with anything organic can be carbon dated, of course. Bone and wood are the best, but textiles as well, due to the, I don't have to explain, degradation to you of isotopes. Metal cannot do this, obviously, so to date metal artifacts, what we as archaeologists do is look for them being found in context with datable organics. And if they're not, it's much harder to date them unless they're very old, and we use strata. So relative dating methods, either using stratigraphy dating or using dating with being found in context with datable organics.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Kelly, are you there?
I am here. Hi.
Hi.
It was great, Marv. It is so good to see you, and I'm really excited to see the fruition of all this research.
Thank you.
I agree about the need for databases. I really appreciated Chris Palmer's questions. You've got me thinking about work that we need to have done right here in our backyard that has nothing to do with this era. But the destructive questions were good, destructive versus non-destructive. And thinking about all the other places you'd like to go to start to populate this database, where would you begin? And then a related question, which maybe Anna could answer, like, because of our connections with Matt Walsh and the museums over there, do you have some like real potential options to take this and roll with it?
Well, and I would hope so. That's really where I would start, is with Ling et al. And Melheim et al. And their research. Those folks conducted quite a lot of, excuse me, of provenance determinations, a lot of microchemical analysis, not just of their artifacts, but of ores across their research. And I would like to start there, and with a few other researchers who are prolific in this field. There's names that appear over and over and over again in this thesis, because those folks just keep doing it. Killick and Fenn are good examples. Big fans of archaeometallurgy, do a lot of different research studies over the last almost 20 years. And I would like to get a hold of them and start by getting their comparative data. And with the knowledge that this is what I want to do, is I want to put this into a database. I want to start building. Obviously, we would require different databases for different metals, but ideally you wouldn't separate them by region either. So you would have an ore database for iron that would just be iron, and you should be able to, if I were establishing this thing, I'd have to get with a computer engineer, because I don't have any ability to design websites or databases, but where you would be able to do your ICP-MS analysis of a metal artifact, put the results of that into a search bar essentially, and it would search and tell you if it came up with any matches and how much match. 90% match for this, the same way that we look at DNA, but for metal. That's kind of how I would want to set that up.
I forgot I muted myself, which is good, because then you didn't hear my, oh, yeah. So the Lake Superior copper culture, I know North America isn't your topic, but Chris's question also got my brain thinking about that.
Yeah.
I've been directly involved in the work, other than maybe doing the archaeological survey up there, but you hear the lore of how Lake Superior copper has been found in, you know, not Midwest and Central America, and I know there's people sourcing it, but I never have followed the details of how they did that.
That's interesting. I didn't find any of their research when I was putting this together. I'll have to look into it.
Yeah, well, that's funny, because that was my question, like, you know, where are they? What are they doing? Are they publishing in like Great Lakes archaeology, you know?
I would be curious to know if they're doing microchemical analysis on their ores or on their artifacts to trace ores, to trace manufacture, or if they're assuming that it's their copper because there aren't too many copper producing cultures in North America.
Right, and it's pure up there, so it does stand out. It's not
Yeah.
alloyed. Yeah. So I noticed in, I thought the thesis was well written. We can maybe get to this later, but just to call out, I noticed that it went back to lowercase Roman numerals when you hit your bibliography. So I know nobody wants to hear that, but like, oh, guess what I saw on the draft?
Oh, did I mess it up?
No, I don't think you did it. I'm guessing that it had something to do with when you imported it, if you imported from Zotero or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, like, small potatoes, not much to worry about. I'd like to give the mic to others and hear other questions, which sometimes spark new ones from me, but I'll just sit quietly here in my corner and thank you for continuing this. It's been a lot, and good for you for pushing through.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thanks, Kelly. Okay, well, I don't have a lot of questions, other than to say this is a great thesis, really,
Thank you.
really exciting research. I wonder if you could just reflect on what you think are really sort of exciting developments in Viking archaeology right now.
Oh man, I mean, this thing with these Ulfberg swords, that's huge. That is so huge. I've been following these weapons, these steel weapons for years, way before I was doing any anthropological research. And you can Google and watch all the documentaries you want to about all the mysterious ways that this was developed, the theories that the Vikings had developed their own special crucible steel techniques and their forging, and unraveling that mystery is so interesting to me. Not only that, but the discovery that the early Proto-Swedish, in the Bronze Age, at the end of the Bronze Age, they found the kind of steel that they have, iron, bog iron, which is a whole thing. It's not deep earth forming. It forms from percolation through the roots of trees and bogs of the minerals. So you dig a whole tree out to get this lump of slag that's developed around the roots. And figuring out that that was a metal that they could forge and they could smelt. At the end of the Bronze Age, and independently smelting it, independently developing forging, that's a huge development. Huge. Because most cultures did not independently develop iron technology. Most of them developed it through radiation coming out of the Near East, coming out of the Levant. Like most technologies, bronze did that. And bronze was absolutely developed in Scandinavia from radiation. Ling and Melheim talk about this quite a bit, that they were trading and they learned bronze technology from other groups, but they taught themselves iron, and I think that's extremely fascinating. Mind-blowing research. And what I would want to do myself, if I was going to do independent artifact research, is I would want to take their iron swords, their pots, their helmets, and I would want to get at what they were talking about with artifacts coming from the same place, but in the Iron Age. Is a specific source of iron more likely for swords than it is for helmets in terms of trade, because they were getting iron from all over the place. So I think those are some of the most interesting developments they've had, and kind of what I would like to see happen in the future.
So you could see building this more comprehensive database and then using that
Yeah,
to address some specific questions. Could that discussion of differential source metals with reference to different kinds of artifacts speak to broader questions to do with labor, gender work, political organization?
oh, absolutely. If, you have to, looking at economies, and I don't know ancient Viking economies well enough to make determinations on what they paid for stuff. But if you find that a certain kind of ore is more pure iron and it's easier to turn into steel, it alloys better. You can assume that it would be more expensive, and you could assume you wouldn't want to use it for things like spoons and belt buckles. But I think that these kind of analyses could really drive at asking those questions, could start illuminating how does commerce interplay with culture on all fronts, and how does commerce encourage evolution? How does evolution encourage commerce in these cultures on both a small and a large scale?
Have you read much of Neil Price's work?
I haven't.
Okay. One of the things that he talks about is the incredibly cosmopolitan culture that, or at least the picture that archaeologists are painting now of Vikings as not just bad guys that beat up on Irish monks,
Right.
but also people who were extensive traders, were hard negotiators,
Yeah,
and as well as warriors and farmers, and they just did a whole lot of things. And it seems like there's a lot of theoretical discussion that could use some real hard-nosed
agreed.
research.
And that's why this Ulfberg thing is of such interest. I really could have written a dissertation on, a whole thesis on just other people's research on those swords. I chose to not fall down that rabbit hole that late in my thesis, but those are a good example. The iron they're using and the techniques they're using are not their own. You don't learn someone else's forging technique by beating them up. So you go to where they are and you talk to them and you interact with them, and that's helping to build this more cosmopolitan idea of the Viking cultures. Though some of it seems a bit romanticized. I like the parts that use hard science. That's for sure one of my favorite parts about this archaeometallurgy, is that it's very hard science in archaeology, in anthropology, which it got pushback, a lot of pushback early on because of that. Because cultural anthropologists go, hard science and hard scientific principles don't work in anthropology. And I think we can all agree that we've moved past that to a point. There's still people out there who are pushing back, from my understanding, in our field, going, I don't know, it seems like chemistry, seems like metallurgy, seems like geology. I don't know if that applies to humans. We're unpredictable. We're not. We're really not.
Well, we also do unpredictable things like trade goods, and we need metallurgy to track that.
Right.
Sometimes. Good. Chris or Kelly, do you have anything more to add? Further questions or thoughts?
Oh, I guess I kind of do. I just got excited when, and this is maybe for Chris and anybody else in Radio Land, to bring you into the world of archaeology. We don't usually find an intact sword or an intact helmet. We find like a fragment of metal and wonder what it is. And there are databases throughout the world that have like metal frags as all you see in the catalog. And sometimes you get lucky and there's enough of it that you can identify, oh, it was from a cast iron stove, cool. But thinking out loud, I perked up so much to think if one of the many things you see that come from this are patterns, and that one type of metal is used for swords or helmets, that might help with all the probably infinite numbers of like holy rusted metal, right?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Like 100%.
So cool. Besides from like the point that Anna made of all the different questions, and you don't even know where this could go or where it could take us, that will be very anthropological.
Well, and to play into that, Kelly, like that's where metallographic analysis is king, because you don't beat a helmet the same way you beat a sword when you're forging them. You don't temper them in the same way. Anytime you apply heat and you cool it, or you apply pressure, you're changing the organization of the structure of this metal, right? So if you can look at this holy metal shards, this frags, metallographically, you can determine what technique was used in forging. You can eliminate half of the options right off the bat. Archaeometallurgy can do a lot with all these collections that are collecting dust. Let us do it, we want to, you know?
Yeah. And there is a curation crisis, and there like really is no more room at the inn. It's time to focus everything on the ones that are here. Sorry to go preachy, but like way to bring it to full relevance. That's all I've got.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly.
I don't have any more questions, thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Good. Audience?
I do.
Good.
So I'm Nancy Mahoney, and Marve was an undergraduate student and a TA of mine, and I teach at OSU. I have a couple of things, if that's okay. Okay. First thing is, well done, congratulations.
Thank you.
Secondly, responding to Kelly talking about the copper culture, one of the very first publications ever in Montana was by H. Melville Sayre, who was not quite an archaeologist, but wanted to be, and he taught at Montana School of Mines in Butte, subject of a lot of research I've done in Montana, and his very first publication with a geochemist was about a copper artifact found in Montana. So very, very interesting, but that is the very beginnings of archaeology in Montana were actually metallurgy. So
That's awesome.
I have that article. It's very short, not very interesting, but more has been done with those artifacts since then. Secondly, for my master's thesis, I worked with, my advisor had a medieval site in Morocco, and it was a medieval Islamic site, and my job was to go over to Rabat and to do the paleoethnobotany, so I had to float the samples and then ship them back home and analyze them. And so as I did it, I had the light fraction, which was the seeds, but then I also kept the heavy fraction because there was a lot of interesting things in there, and there was a lot of iron, slag, and metallurgy. So I'm just wondering about collections that might have, because part of what I ended up writing about in my thesis, which I didn't initially intend, was that as we were trying to understand this area, I'm looking at the plants, but then I'm also looking at fragments of manufacture that are coming out in the heavy fraction. And that became part of my whole thesis and story. So more than just the artifacts, as Kelly was saying, it's also sort of looking at the residues of the process, which gets me to my question, which is that working at Arizona State University on my doctorate, craft production was everything that we talked about, and we talked about it in terms of pottery, because that's what we have in the Four Corners area. And every single person that I was in school with did neutron activation analysis, X-ray fluorescence, everything on pottery, because the goal was to try to understand how pots were moving around, but also the scale in which way they were manufactured. What was the gender thing of it? Were some places, once people start to aggregate manufacturing for export, these are always huge questions when you look at big centers like Chaco Canyon that showed up for a while. And so it seems so interesting to me that the examples you had in your thesis were getting at some really interesting, unexpected things. But I think your question was the same direction as where I'd love to see this go, is this is trying to understand the social, political, economic organization down to the household level or gender. Who's doing it? Who's making it? Who's organizing it? Are they just getting in the raw materials and then making it themselves? And are they able to sort different kinds of raw materials because, as you said, different types of objects? Like, there's so much to be understood about the organization of those societies. Just from being able to answer those questions. And for me, it was like magic to get back these things about, well, these pots are from different clays than these pots, and these pots are sourced to here. And it was the same thing. We have the macroscopic, where you could look in and see what the temper is in the clay and the clay colors. And then we could also have these much deeper levels of analysis. And so for me, it's kind of astonishing. I guess I thought all that was going on, but just in Europe. because we didn't have all the same degree of it, which we have with pottery in the Southwest. So it seems like it's just ripe for like an explosion, and I feel like places, centers like the Max Planck Institute in Germany that does everything on modern human origins and Neanderthal DNA, but like there should be a university over in Europe, right, that's kind of capable of being the center for a database like this, because once you have that going and you have those geochemists who are keeping all those samples in their labs, you could really start getting into within site, intrasite and intersite analysis in a much more interesting way. And so along the way, were you thinking about questions of like, who the hell is making this stuff? Who the hell is trading it? These are different people at different levels. Like, did you formulate any interesting questions about like the real people behind these metals themselves? Yeah,
absolutely. As I'm reading it, what I'm really trying to figure out, this was the research that was done in Iceland was a good example of that. Because they're trade sites, but they're not trade sites. They're farms. And these farms operated as trade sites. So we're talking about just some farmers, that's how their culture was working.
And they needed to import it all, right? Like they didn't have any natural sources?
Oh, they have some natural iron, but not much.
Okay.
Because they don't have a ton. Honestly, there's a lot of iron, but the Scandinavian Nordic groups did not learn deep earth mining. They were using bog iron, it worked. They moved to Iceland, which doesn't have trees or bogs.
Right.
And they found some iron that had basically, the couple of mines that they found are places where, because of geological drop, because of the geophysical climate of Iceland, iron ore had been exposed on the surface, which is just very rare anywhere for deep earth iron to be sitting around on the surface. It doesn't do that much. So that's basically what they had for local sources, and they were using that. They were also importing the iron. They were smelting and refining it there, and then exporting both local and foreign sources to other places. And some of those have been around, like they found a lot of this in the UK, throughout England, which was at that time just coming out of being Nordic occupied. So there's still a lot of Nordic relatives there, folks who had stayed even after the English were no longer under Nordic rule. So there was a lot of trade going on of everything. And I thought that was very interesting that we didn't have specialized tradesmen, traders doing this in Iceland. They were sort of the last European group to come out of the chiefdom level society. Mainland Scandinavia had moved into kingdoms, and Iceland.
And so understanding that organization, I think, is super interesting. Also, I mean, the parallels with pottery, that all these the pots have painted designs, except for the cookingware, which had other indented designs. But figuring out who first made glazes or who first started using certain styles, you have that whole stylistic analysis, which you could do also with these metal artifacts, and then also look at where's the source coming from. And if you're seeing similar metals, but then manufactured into different cultural, there were so many little peaks of possibilities in here, and then just the transition from the bronze to the Iron Age, but then that transition where they're all using their own sources to where then they're all using one source. I just feel like there's so many interesting teaser questions in there that I would love to see someone try to start answering.
I think it was the greatest challenge for this thesis, is that every time I pulled a thread, I would find an entire sweater.
Right. But this is what a thesis is for. That's great. Exactly. Sweaters everywhere.
I couldn't put all the sweaters in there, so I did my best to knit a blanket.
Yeah.
And it's what I could do with it. But there's every time you look at any of these things, there's just so many more questions. And I think it's particularly interesting that even these historical cultures, the Scandinavians come from a time period when history is being recorded, and we're still discovering things that we did not understand before.
Right.
I think that's extremely fascinating.
And that's what I think is just reinforcing the value of archaeology, is they're not writing down a lot of the stuff we want to know and understand about how those political, economic, social systems actually functioned, Yeah. So I think that's great. Good for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we can only get so far with the runes and the monuments that are posted
Yeah,
here and
they're
there.
just telling
around
you what they
San
want to be remembered for.
Exactly,
Yeah.
there's so much behind the scenes that we don't know.
Yes.
One thing to keep in mind for applying for your PhD is you wanna think about these kinds of questions. Not just, building a database is great, that's your methodological
Right.
tactic.
Yes.
You wanna go into it with a particular, framework and questions that you want asked.
Thank you.
Just keep that in mind,
Absolutely.
yeah. Others?
Oh, there's no.
I've asked many, many questions through this process, so.
Okay. Kelly or Chris, anything else?
No, I'm good here, thank you.
Okay,
I'm good here too, thank you.
okay, in that case, I will ask